At 54, Della Rourke owned a set of worn lockpicks, a truck with 190,000 miles on the odometer, and $108 in a checking account. The bank was 3 days from closing. The house she had paid off, one dead bolt and one broken deadlatch at a time, 22 years of other people's locks, was gone. She had signed it away to guarantee a loan for a younger brother, who took the money, took his freight rig, and took the interstate west without so much as a phone call. And on the same flat gray Tuesday, she lost the last thing that carried her name. A lawyer she had never met called to tell her she had inherited something too. Her grandfather's bank, a building the whole town of Amity, Nebraska, had spent 37 years hating him for. Appraised value, $0. The lawyer's name was Hollis Pruitt, and he talked the way old country lawyers talk, slow, like every sentence was a fence post he had to set straight before he moved on to the next one. He told her Amos Rourke had passed in his sleep at 94, that the funeral had been small, that most of the family had already come and gone. Della's brother Curtis had inherited the note on the family home place, which was mortgaged past its worth. Toombs and Lincolns split the cash, which came to less than the cost of the headstone, and Della, the granddaughter nobody in Amity had seen since she was 17, the one who had spent her whole adult life 180 miles east, pretending she wasn't a Rourke at all, got one line in the will. The old bank on the courthouse square, condemned, boarded, worth nothing. Della sat in her truck in the parking lot of a storage unit where the rest of her life now fit into 11 cardboard boxes, and she laughed. It was not a good laugh. It was the sound a person makes when the joke has been going on so long they have finally started to hear it. Her grandfather had ruined the family name, and then handed her the very building that had done the ruining. It was, she thought, exactly the kind of inheritance a Rourke deserved. She drove west into the setting sun with the windows down because the air conditioning had quit in June. The land flattened and opened the way it does out there. The corn giving way to sorghum, the sorghum giving way to pasture, the pasture giving way to that particular Nebraska. Nothing that is not empty at all, if you know how to look at it. The air smelled like cut hay and diesel, and, underneath that, the dry mineral smell of dust that has never once in its life been rained on enough. Grain elevators stood on the horizon like the ghosts of buildings that used to matter. Somewhere out in the shelter belts, the cicadas were sawing the evening in half. She had not meant to come back. She had promised herself at 17, standing at the edge of the schoolyard, while two boys called her grandfather a thief to her face, that she would never come back. But a person with $118 does not get to keep every promise she makes. So she drove. Amity announced itself the way dying towns do, with a water tower you could read the town's whole story on. The paint had faded from Amity to a word that was mostly rust. Below it, the town spread out in a grid that had been laid down by men who believed the future was coming and had built wide streets to receive it. The future had not come. Half the storefronts on the square were dark. The hardware store was a thrift shop now. The movie house had a marquee with no letters, and on the northeast corner, taking up the best spot in town, stood the reason her family had been spoken of in whispers for most of her life. The Amity Farmers and Merchants Bank was built out of honey-colored limestone the year before the First War, back when a small bank on a small square was a promise, a town made to itself. 4 fluted columns held up a portico. Above them, chiseled into the stone in letters 2 feet tall, were the words that had followed Della Rourke through 37 years of her life. Farmers and Am shirts. The windows were boarded with plywood gone silver from the sun. Pigeons had claimed the pediment, and taped across the front doors, at a lazy diagonal, was a bright orange placard from the county that said, "Conned and safe. Do not enter," as if anyone in Amity would have wanted to. Della parked across the square and did not get out for a long time. She had a key. Hollis Pruitt had mailed it to her in a padded envelope, a heavy brass thing worn smooth at the bit, and she turned it over and over in her fingers while the light went from gold to gray to the deep violet that the plains do better than anywhere on earth. She had come to sell it. That was the plan. Sign whatever needed signing, take whatever pennies a condemned building on a dead square was worth, and be gone before anyone recognized her face. She was good at leaving. It was the one thing her family had ever really taught her. She spent the first night in the truck. She told herself it was because it was too late to look at anything. That was a lie. The truth was, she was afraid of the building, and she did not like being afraid of a pile of stone. Hollis Pruitt's office was above the old feed store, up a staircase that smelled like decades of pipe smoke that had soaked into the plaster and never left. He was 80, if he was a day, with reading glasses pushed up on a bald head, spotted like a sparrow's egg. And when Della walked in, he looked at her for a long moment over the top of a file, and something moved across his face that she couldn't read. "You've got his hands," Pruitt said. Amos had hands like that. Working hands. Della said she was a locksmith. She said it the way she always did, flat, so nobody could make it into anything. Pruitt nodded, like that, settled something private for him. Then, he opened the file and started setting his fence posts. The building was hers, free and clear. No liens the county could enforce, because of a wrinkle he'd get to in a minute. The back taxes were smaller than she'd feared, a few $100s, because Amos had somehow kept them paid down to almost nothing for decades on a building nobody used. And there was this, Pruitt said, and he slid a single folded sheet across the desk, brittle at the creases, the ink gone brown. A note in a careful old-fashioned hand. Della read it twice. "Everything they think I took is still inside. You of all of them can open it. Don't let them tear it down before you look. Della girl, look before you decide anything at all." Pop. She had not been called girl in 37 years. She had not, in fact, ever once heard her grandfather call her anything, because she had been raised to keep away from him, the way you keep a child away from a stove. Her mother had married out of the Rourke shame and spent her whole life of apologizing for it, and here was the dead man's handwriting, reaching across all of it, calling her girl and telling her to look. "Look at what?" she asked. Pruitt took off his reading glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "There's a codicil," he said, "from 1986, the year after the bank failed. Amos bought this building back from the federal receivers with his own money, put it into a trust and locked it up with terms I have spent 40 years being paid $1 a year to protect." He was very specific. He said one day a Rourke would come who worked with her hands and had lost her own door, and that she was the only one who'd be able to open his. He said no one was to tear it down until she'd stood inside the vault. Pruitt folded his glasses. "I always figured he was a sentimental old fool. Now here you are. Lost your house, I hear. Work with your hands." He watched her. So maybe he wasn't a fool. Maybe he was just early. Della drove back to the square with the note on the seat beside her and pulled the orange placard off the door, without letting herself think about it. The brass coche turned like it had been waiting. And she stepped into the dark cool inside of a building that had been holding its breath since before she was born. The air was the first thing, thick and still, smelling of old paper and pigeon and the particular flat mineral smell of stone that never sees the sun. Light came in gray bars through the gaps in the plywood and laid itself across a marble floor, cracked in a long diagonal, like a dry riverbed. The teller counters were still there, dark oak worn pale where 1,000 hands had rested. Brass grills, green with age, arched over the windows where farmers had once handed across their whole year's work in a canvas sack. A grandfather clock stood stopped against the wall, its face at 6:42, its pendulum still. And at the back of the great room, set into a wall of the same honey limestone, stood the door of the vault. It was enormous, a round steel door 2 feet thick, its face a constellation of dials and levers and a great spoked wheel like the helm of a ship. It had been built by a company in Cincinnati that had been out of business for 80 years, built in an age when men believed steel could hold back time itself. And it was, Della saw when she got close, not quite closed. The wheel had been left one turn shy of seated, the bolts drawn back. Someone had wanted it openable. Someone had made sure of it. She did not open it that day. She told herself she needed better light. That was a lie, too. Because as she turned to go, a dog came out of the shadows behind the counters. It was old, a heeler gone gray at the muzzle, one eye clouded to milk, moving with the careful dignity of an animal that has learned exactly which of its legs still work. It did not bark. It simply stood between Della and the vault and looked at her, and then a voice came out of the dark of the back hall, low and wary. "He won't bite. But you should go." The young man was maybe 21, lean in the way of someone who eats when there's food and doesn't think much about it when there isn't. With a week of beard and eyes that watched her hands instead of her face, the way people learn to watch when hands have been the thing that hurt them. He had a broom in one fist, which told Della something before he said a word. Nobody sweeps a floor they're planning to walk away from. His name, when she finally got it out of him, was Silas. He had been sleeping in the old boiler room since spring. He kept the dog fed, whose name was Dime, and he kept the vault door oiled, though he couldn't have said why, except that the old man had asked him to. Della asked him which old man. Silas looked at her like she was slow. "Mr. Rourke," he said. "He used to come sit in here, even after they condemned it. He'd give me $5 to sweep, and then he'd sit in that chair by the vault and just look at it." Silas's jaw worked. "Everybody in this town says he was a crook. He gave me a place to sleep and never once asked me for anything. So I don't know who's lying, but somebody is." Della looked at the swept floor, at the oiled hinges on a vault nobody was supposed to open, at a dying dog somebody had chosen to keep alive, and for the first time in 37 years, she felt the story she'd been handed start to shift under her feet like ice going soft. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something small. If a story like this one means anything to you, take 1 second to subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It costs you nothing. And it's the only way stories like Amos Rourke's ever find the people who need them. Now, back to Della and the door she was afraid to open. She came back the next morning with a work light, a stethoscope, and 40 years of knowing how steel wants to talk to the person patient enough to listen. A vault lock is not so different from any other lock. It is only a set of wheels that want to fall into a line, and a person who can feel the line better than she can see it. Della set the light on the counter, pressed the diaphragm of the stethoscope to the cold steel, and began slowly to turn. She did not need to crack it, as it turned out, because taped to the underside of the great spoked wheel, where only a person kneeling to work the dial would ever find it, was a strip of masking tape gone yellow, and on it, in the same careful hand as the note, a string of numbers. And beside the numbers, one word: Ada. Her grandmother's name. The combination to a bank vault was the birthday of a woman who had been dead for 50 years, hidden where only the person willing to get down on the floor and try would see it. Della sat back on her heels, and something in her chest that had been clenched since she was 17 came loose by a single notch. She dialed the numbers. She hauled on the wheel, and the bolts drew back with a sound like a held breath finally let go, and the 2-foot door swung on its balanced hinges as light as a screen door in summer. And Della Rourke stepped into the thing her grandfather had spent his last 40 years guarding, and stopped, and did not understand what she was looking at. It was not money. She had let herself imagine money, a little, the way you can't help it. There was no money. 3 of the 4 walls of the vault were covered floor to ceiling in small steel doors, hundreds of them. No, she counted, later, 41 of them, each with a brass number and a keyhole, and a little frame for a card. Safe deposit boxes, and every single one of them had a family name written on the card in her grandfather's hand. Ostergaard, Bittner, Kubiak, Vandenberg, Reyes. 41 names, 41 Amity families, the whole vanished town filed away behind steel like a library of the dead. The keys hung on a board just inside the door, 41 of them, labeled. Della took down the first, box 11, the Ostergaard box, and fitted it and turned it, and slid out the long steel drawer, and set it on the little marble shelf, and lifted the lid. Inside was a fiddle, an old violin, its varnish crazed with age, its bridge fallen, 4 strings gone slack. Wrapped around its neck was a Polaroid photograph, the colors gone to orange, of a young couple standing in front of a white farmhouse with 3 small children lined up on the porch steps. Everybody squinting into the sun, everybody laughing at something outside the frame. And folded beneath the fiddle was a document, a real one, a warranty deed, county recorder's stamp and all, to 160 acres in the northeast quarter of Amity Township, in the name of Nils and Maureen Ostergaard. And on the inside of the box lid, painted small and neat, was a single word, held. Della did not understand. She opened box 12, the Bittner box. Inside, a woman's wedding ring, thin gold worn to a wire, wrapped around another Polaroid, another family, another deed to another quarter section. Held. She opened box 19, the Kubiak box, and inside was a purple heart, the ribbon faded, the metal heavy in her palm, and a deed and a photograph of a young man in a uniform who never came home from wherever they'd sent him. Held. She opened box after box after box, and by the 10th one, she was sitting on the cold marble floor of the vault with her back against the drawers and her hands over her mouth, because she finally understood what her grandfather had done, and what the whole town had gotten exactly backward for 37 years. She needed Pruitt to say it, though. She needed to hear it out loud from someone who had been there. So that afternoon, she sat across the pipe smoke desk and made the old lawyer tell her the story he had kept for 40 years. It was the farm crisis, Pruitt said. You're too young to remember it right, but it gutted this country out here. Interest rates went to the moon. Land prices collapsed. A man who'd borrowed against $300 corn was trying to pay it back with $2 corn. And the big regional bank that held the paper on half this county started calling the loans foreclosing. And when a farm goes to the courthouse steps, Della, it doesn't go back to a neighbor. It goes to whoever's got cash. Speculators. Out-of-state money. Insurance companies. Pruitt's jaw tightened around the memory. They were going to strip this whole valley and sell it off in pieces to men who'd never set foot on it. He was quiet a moment, and then he told her the part the town had never known. Your grandfather went to the courthouse steps himself. Every auction for 4 years. And he outbid the speculators. He bought his neighbors' farms out from under the men who'd have carved them up. He used the bank's capital first, and when that ran dry, he used his own. And when that ran dry, he borrowed against this building. Pruitt tapped the desk. And here's the thing that broke him, and broke the bank, and made this whole town spit at the name Rourke for a generation. He never told them. He bought the Ostergaard place, and he let Nils Ostergaard keep farming it, kept the deed in that vault, and told Nils only that the debt was handled. He bought 41 farms, and he handed the families their lives back so quietly that they never even knew whose hand had done it. Most of them thought the bank had foreclosed and let them stay on as tenants. Out of spite, some of them were so ashamed they packed up and left in the night. And every last one of them believed Amos Rourke had taken their land. Why, Della said. Why would he let them think that? Pruitt looked out the window at the water tower. Because a man out here would rather be hated than pitied, he said. If Amos had stood up in the church basement and announced that he'd saved 41 families, he'd have shamed every one of them. He'd have turned proud people into charity cases in front of their neighbors. So, he took the blame instead. He let them keep their land and their pride both, and the only thing he asked in return, the only thing, was that they never find out. Pruitt's voice had gone rough. The bank failed in '85. He was 57 years old, and he'd spent every dollar he had, and every dollar the bank had saving people who cursed his name at the feed store. The federal men came in and shut the doors, and Amos Rourke stood on that portico and let this whole town watch him fail, and he never said one word in his own defense. Not one. For 37 years, Della thought about the boxes, about the word painted inside every lid, held. About a man sitting in a chair in the dark in front of a locked vault, year after year, keeping other people's lives safe behind steel, because they were too proud to be given them in the light. The keepsakes, she said. The ring, the medal, the fiddle, what are those? Ah, Pruitt said, and for the first time he almost smiled. That was the other thing he did. Toward the end, when folks were truly desperate, they'd come to the counter and offer him something. A wedding ring, a dead son's medal, a fiddle that had come over from the old country. Collateral, they'd call it, so it wouldn't feel like begging. And Amos would give them the cash and take the thing and put it in the vault. And he'd tell every one of them the same words. He'd say, I'm just holding it for you. Come get it when you're able. Pruitt shook his head. Not one of them ever came. They were too ashamed, or they moved away, or they died. So he just kept holding, 40 years. He held everything they thought he stole, and he waited for someone who'd open the door and give it all back. Della drove back to the square in the last light and let herself into the bank, and sat down in her grandfather's one, facing the open vault, and she understood at last why he had sat there. He had been keeping watch over the only honest thing he had left. His side of a story nobody wanted to hear. She went through the boxes again that night, slower, reading every name on every card by the light of the work lamp. And it was somewhere around the 30th box that she noticed the thing that hollowed her out. There was no box that said Rourke. 41 families, 41 quarter sections saved, 41 lives handed quietly back, and not one drawer, not one deed, not one keepsake, held back for his own blood. She sat with that for a long time in the cold of the vault. She thought about her mother, who had grown up in a drafty rented house in this town while her father was out at the courthouse. Steps. Spending the family's future on the neighbors, a girl who wore hand-me-downs and got called the crook's daughter, and married the first man who'd take her away from Amity, and never came back. She thought about the college she herself had never gone to, the years of scraping, the house she'd finally clawed her way to owning, and then lost. She had spent her whole life poor and ashamed, and she had blamed her grandfather for both. And she had been half right. He had made them poor. He had done it on purpose. He had taken his own family's security and given it away to people who cursed him for it. And he had let his daughter and his granddaughter carry the shame of it because he could not save the town and spare his own name at the same time. And he had chosen the town. It was the cruelest thing Della had ever learned about a person, and it was also, she understood as she sat there, the closest thing to grace she had ever stood inside of. He had not kept a single box for himself. He had spent everything, including his good name, including his family's peace, and he had asked for nothing back but that someone, someday, open the door and finish the giving. Della put her face against the cold steel of the empty Rourke space that did not exist, and she grieved. At last, for a man she had never once been allowed to meet. She could have sold the building then. She could have taken the check and driven east and let Amity keep its comfortable old lie. Instead, she took down box 11, the Ostergaard box, with the fiddle and the ring of a life inside it, and she asked Silas if he knew where a woman named Maureen Ostergaard lived. Maureen Ostergaard was 91 and lived with her granddaughter in a farmhouse. Della recognized the second she saw it, because she had held its Polaroid in her hand that morning. The white paint had gone to the color of old bone. The porch steps were the same steps 3 squinting children had lined up on in 1961. And when Della set the box on the kitchen table and lifted out the fiddle and the photograph, the old woman put both hands flat on the oilcloth and did not speak for a very long time. "That's Nils's fiddle," she finally said. "He sold it to your grandfather in the winter of '84 so we could pay the propane bill and not freeze." She touched the strings. "He told me the bank took it. He told me Rourke took it and wouldn't give it back, the hard old crook." Maureen looked up, and her eyes were bright and terrible. "We buried Nils 15 years ago hating that man. We taught our children to hate him. And you're telling me." She stopped. She could not finish it. Della finished it for her, gently. She told her the fiddle had never been sold, only held. She told her about the deed folded beneath it, the 160 acres her granddaughter was farming right now, that had been in that vault in the Ostergaard name the whole time, that Amos Rourke had bought at auction to keep it out of a stranger's hands, and then quietly, for 37 years, given back $1 at a time by simply letting them stay. She told her what her grandfather had said to every soul who'd handed him something precious in the worst moment of their lives. "I'm just holding it for you." Maureen Ostergaard put her face in her hands, a 91-year-old woman at her own kitchen table, and wept for a man she had spent her whole life getting wrong. Word travels through a small town like water finds a low spot. By the end of that week they had started to come. An old man named Frank Kubiak drove up in a truck older than Silas and stood in the vault holding his brother's Purple Heart and could not say a single word, just held it to his chest and shook. The Bittner grandchildren came for a wedding ring. Their grandmother had gone to her grave. Believing was pawned and lost. A man named Tomas Reyes, whose family had left Amity in shame in 1986 and driven all the way from Kansas when he heard, opened box 30 and found the pocket watch his father had given the bank as collateral and never dared come back for, and a deed to the 80 acres his family had farmed for 3 generations before they fled, land that had been waiting in the dark with their name on it the entire time they were gone. Not all of them came easy. A man named Dale Prentice drove up from 3 counties over, a man who had, 40 years before, stood in the church basement and told the whole town that Amos Rourke had foreclosed on his father and put the family out on the road, a story that had done as much as any to fix the Rourke name as a curse. He came into the vault stiff and defensive, a big man gone gray, ready to be lied to. Della handed him box 26. Inside was a deed to his father's farm in the Prentice name, and a photograph of a barn Dale had helped raise as a boy, and a brass belt buckle. His father had given the bank the winter they nearly starved. Held. Dale Prentice stood there and read the deed 3 times, and then he sat down heavily on the marble floor, a grown man in his 60s, and said, in a voice that came apart in the middle, that his father had died in a rented room in Grand Island, still cursing Amos Rourke, and that he had carried that curse forward and taught it to his own children, and that he did not know how a person was supposed to live with having gotten a thing that wrong for that long. Della did not have an answer for him. She only sat down on the floor beside him, and after a while she told him the truth, which was that his father had kept his land the whole time and never known it, and that being wrong about a good man was a lighter thing to carry than most, because it could be set down the moment you decided to. A young woman came for the Vandenberg box, a nurse in her 30s who had grown up, hearing that her great-grandmother's opal pull had been swindled away by the bank. She opened the drawer with shaking hands, and there it was, the opal gone, milky with age, wrapped around a Polaroid of a wedding, and beneath it the deed that had kept 80 acres in the family for a generation that never knew it was in danger. She did not cry. She just put the ring on and turned it in the light, and said quietly that she was going to drive to the cemetery and tell her grandmother, out loud, that the story had been wrong, because someone ought to say it over the grave, even if the grave couldn't hear. Della gave it all back with her own hands. 41 boxes, one at a time, and to each family she said the same words, because they were the only words that fit. He wanted me to tell you. He was just holding it for you. She did not do it alone. Silas learned the families' names and drove the ones who couldn't drive. Dime, the old healer, lay in the bar of sunlight by the open vault and watched them come and go. And the town of Amity, which had spent 37 years so sure of what it knew, walked into that limestone, building one family at a time, and had to set that certainty down at the door. There is a particular quiet that comes over people who realize they have been wrong for a very long time about something that mattered. It is not comfortable. It is the sound a whole town makes when it finally understands the size of what it did to a good man, and the size of what he let it do, on purpose, so that it could keep its pride, which is when the black car came. It was a new SUV, the kind that costs more than most of the trucks in Amity put together. It parked across the square with 2 wheels up on the curb. Like the curb was something that happened to other people. The man who got out wore a soft gray jacket with no tie and shoes that had never touched a gravel road. His name was Grant Merrow, and he represented a development group out of Omaha. And he had a leather folder and a smile that had been practiced in a mirror. He'd been trying to buy the whole Northeast block for a year, he explained. Walking the vault like a man pricing scrap. A distribution center. Good jobs, he said. A future for a town that clearly needed one. He said clearly like it was a kindness. He had already optioned the thrift store and the empty movie house and the corner lot. He needed the bank. The bank was the keystone. And he understood, he said, that Della had just inherited a condemned liability with back taxes and a demolition order. And that a woman in her position, he glanced at her truck across the square. A woman in her position probably needed cash, more than she needed a pile of falling down stone. He slid a paper across the marble teller counter. $46,000. He said the number like it was a rescue. Then he looked at the walls of open safe deposit boxes. 41 little steel doors standing open, and he saw exactly one thing in them. Scrap brass, he said, half to himself. I'll have the crew salvage the copper before they take her down. He had stood inside the single most valuable thing in that town, a vault full of 41 families' whole histories, and he had appraised it at the price of the metal. Della looked at the $46,000. She had $118 to her name and no house, and a truck with a bad compressor. $46,000 was a door she could walk through. It would have been so easy. Before I tell you what she did, let me stop one more time, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. If you've come this far with Della, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button. And tell me in the comments one word what you'd have done if you were standing in that vault with $118 and a stranger's check on the counter. I read everyone now. Grant Merrow and the thing he didn't know. Della told him she'd have her lawyer look it over. Merrow's smile flickered, because men like Merrow don't like the word lawyer. Coming out of a woman they've decided is desperate. He recovered and said sure, of course, but the demolition order was already on the calendar, and the county wasn't going to hold it forever. And a condemned building was a dangerous thing to sit on, legally speaking. It was not quite a threat. It was the shape a threat makes when it's wearing a soft gray jacket. He left his card on the marble and drove his SUV off the curb and away. Hollis Pruitt came down to the bank the next morning, and he was, for the first time since Della had met him, almost happy. He knew, Pruitt said, easing himself into Amos's chair. Your grandfather knew this day was coming 40 years before it got here. He knew that someday the land would be worth more dead than alive to somebody, and that a smiling man with a folder would come to finish what the speculators started in '85. So he built a wall. Pruitt opened his file. Not a wall of stone, a wall of paper, and it is the finest piece of quiet lawyering I have ever seen in 60 years at the bar. He laid it out for her the way Amos had built it. In 1986, when Amos bought the shuttered building back from the federal receivers, he had not simply taken title. He had placed the building into a charitable trust, the Amity Legacy Trust, with a preservation covenant recorded against the deed. The covenant said the building could never be demolished, never be sold for commercial development, and had to remain open to the people of Amity in perpetuity. A covenant like that runs with the land. It does not care who owns the building. It does not care about a demolition order for a leaky roof, which is a repair, not a wrecking ball. Merrow could offer $46,000 or $46 million. He could not buy what the deed itself would not permit to be sold. But the vault was the masterpiece. Because those 41 farm deeds had never been left loose in a box for a court to fight over. Amos had spent the last decade of his life, with Pruitt's help, quietly conveying each of those quarter sections into 41 separate family trusts, each one naming the original family and their heirs. Each one with a clause that the land could never be aggregated, subdivided for development, or sold to any single buyer assembling a parcel. The keepsakes in the boxes were gifts returned to their owners. But the land underneath the whole northeast quarter of the township was already, legally, spoken for. It belonged to the Ostergaards and the Bittners and the Kubiaks and the Reyeses, in trust, protected by a dead man's forethought. And no development group on earth could gather it up. Amos Rourke had reached out of his grave and taken the ground out from under Grant Merrow. Before Grant Merrow was old enough to shave. He knew, Pruitt said, again softly, that they'd never believe he was a good man while he was alive. So he made sure they'd be safe from the bad ones after he was gone. That was the deal he made with himself. He'd take the town's hatred, and in exchange the town would keep its land forever. He just needed one Rourke at the end to open the door and let them see it. Grant Merrow came back once more, with a lawyer of his own and a raised voice. And he stood in the great marble room, and threatened litigation and eminent domain, and county pressure, and Hollis Pruitt let him finish, and then handed him the covenant, and the 41 trust instruments and watched him, read them, and watched the color leave his face, and watched him understand that he had been beaten by a country banker who had been dead for 2 months, and whose name he had used. Only that morning, as a punchline, Merrow left without another word. His SUV did not come back to Amity again. Della stayed. She had not planned to. But somewhere between the Ostergaard fiddle and the Reyes pocket watch, between an old dog in a bar of sunlight, and a young man who oiled a hinge because a dead man had asked him to, she had run out of reasons to leave and found, to her own surprise, 41 reasons to stay. She used the little that came in. The taxes had been paid so far ahead by Amos that the trust could carry the building for years. To fix the roof first, the way you fix a roof, one square at a time, on your knees, with your own hands. She and Silas pulled the plywood off the windows and let the light back in. The marble floor got swept every morning by 2 people now, Stedville Salmonsman. Dime supervised. She did not reopen it as a bank. A bank was not what Amity needed, and not what her grandfather had really been running there at the end anyway. What he'd been running was a place where people could set down the thing that was too heavy to carry and trust that it would be kept safe and given back. So that was what she made. She hung a hand-painted sign under the old chiseled letters, small, so as not to argue with the stone, and it said simply, "The Rourke Room, open." She put a coffee pot on the counter. She let the vault stand open, 41 boxes empty now, their little doors ajar, their lives returned. And she started, quietly, to hold things again. Not money. She was no banker. But a woman came in whose husband had left, and whose kids were hungry. And Della kept a jar on the counter that the town fed without anybody being told to, and nobody who took from it was ever asked why. Silas learned to fix locks alongside her And on the mornings a farmer couldn't make a truck payment, she taught the boy that there are debts you collect and debts you simply forgive, and that a wise man knows the difference and never announces which is which. The Rourke name, which had been a curse in Amity for 37 years, became, over one slow prairie autumn, something else. Something people said the way you say the name of a person who turned out, against all the evidence, to have been on your side the whole time. There was one box left. Della had noticed it the first day and left it for last, the way you save the thing you're afraid of. Box 42. There were only 41 family names. But the vault had been built for 42 boxes, and the last one, the one in the bottom corner, had a card in her grandfather's hand that did not have a family name on it at all. It said, "For the one comes next." She opened it on the first cold morning of October, when the light came flat and gold through the windows they'd unboarded, and the cicadas had finally gone quiet for the year. Inside was a single sheet of paper. And it was not a deed, and it was not a letter of explanation. And it was not a lecture. It was a receipt. A blank one. From the bank from 1985, with the old letterhead, and across it, in the careful hand she had come to know better than her own mother's, Amos Rourke had written the only thing he had left to say, to whoever finally opened his door. "You found it. Good. Now it's yours to keep. Not the building, the habit. Hold what people can't carry. Give it back when they can carry it. Take the blame, if you have to, and never take the credit. And leave one box open, always, for the one who comes after you. I'm just holding it for you, girl. Come get it when you're able." Della Rourke stood in the vault her grandfather had guarded for 40 years, in the town that had cursed her name since she was a child, and she did the only thing that made any sense. She took a lockpick from her pocket, the one worn smoothest, the one her hands had shaped over 22 years of opening what other people had shut. And she set it in the empty box 42, and she wrote a card in her own hand and slid it into the little brass frame. And then she left the box open, the way she'd been told, for the one who'd come next. Because she understood now what her grandfather had understood at 57, standing on that portico, letting a whole town watch once fail, that a legacy is not the money you keep, or the name they carve over your door. It is not even the land, though the land matters. A legacy is the thing you're willing to hold in the dark, unthanked, for as long as it takes, until the person it belongs to is finally able to come and claim it. It is the door you refuse to let them lock. It is the light you leave on in a building everyone else has given up on. She was 54 years old. She had arrived with $118 and no home and a name that shamed her, and she had inherited, it turned out, the richest thing in Amity, Nebraska. Hidden all along behind a 2-foot steel door in a bank the whole town had appraised at zero. The vault stayed open, the coffee stayed on, and every evening before she and Silas locked the front doors, Della would leave the desk lamp burning by the vault the way Pop had, so that anyone in Amity who was carrying something too heavy would know, walking past on the dark square, that there was still one place in this world where a person could set it down and trust that it would be held. "I'm just holding it for you." The town learned to say to one another, in the years that followed when someone was down and couldn't ask, "Come get it when you're able." They always came, eventually. Somebody had finally opened the door and shown them they could.